Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Today's first session this afternoon is on translation, text, and placemaking. My name's Mclaughlin, and I'll be chairing the session today. We are going to be joined by a couple of presenters online, but also we have in person some presenters here in the panel, who I'll introduce in a moment, and a little bit of a shuffle of the running order as well. We will be joined by, first over here, Jeremy Duval or Duval. We were talking about this earlier. It's kind of an interesting kind of new area of studies, border crossing issue around pronunciation there. Jeremy Duval will be is from the University of Exeter, and will be presenting on the contested politics of local place attachments, examples from post-war German Heimat debates. And before him will come Rebecca Pinner, who is next here. Hi, Rebecca. UEA's own Rebecca Pinner, who will be talking about mud on the margins, identity, borders, and belonging in the imagined East Anglian Fenland. Then before Rebecca, we'll have, I'm going in reverse order if you haven't noticed, Iona Macduff, also UEA, Climate Imaginaries, Small Stories, Realities, the Necessary Nuance of Place Writing, which I'm looking forward to hearing. Iona, I hope you can hear me online. I will just check here. Oh, okay, just a little bit of a chat there. Then I suppose because Naomi and Yordon are unfortunately unable to dial in at the moment, Philip Wilson will begin. Is that all right, Philip, if you jump in first? Philip, another of our UEA colleagues, is going to talk about relocation in literary translation. Very exciting. So I will try and keep an eye on the time. I think we have 15 minutes each. Is that right? Is that the kind of standard budget for time? Here we go. And there's your PowerPoint. So I shall scoot out your way and no talk about general affairs. Philip Wilson, everyone.
Hi.
Oh. Yes, no, fine. Nice way to, thank you very much. Nice way to welcome our guests.
I really appreciate that. Thank you very much indeed. Here we go. Let's have a look at this picture, actually. This is a play. It's about a civil war. There is a woman looking at her daughter who has just died in the Civil War. And, you know, if I asked you to have a guess who wrote it, I guess you might start to search through your mental banks and, you know, through African playwrights, because there's plays about civil war in Africa, come up with some names, Wole Soyinka, who, well, I'll give you the correct answer. The author of this play is Bertolt Brecht. The play is called Mutter Courage und ihre Kinder, which is translated into English as Mother Courage and Her Children. This is a relocation, and that's the theme of today's talk from me, relocation in literary translation. This first came to me, this idea, when I was watching television and I saw this program called Sherlock. And I was quite intrigued by this because I'm quite a fan of the original Sherlock Holmes stories. And I was watching this and I thought, isn't this odd? I kind of know what's going to happen, because what they've done is they've fast forwarded this story, A Study in Scarlet, and they've called it A Study in Pink. And they've kind of fast forwarded to London of the present day. So Dr. Watson, there he is on the left. If you know the original stories, Dr. Watson is a doctor who has served in Afghanistan in the colonial adventure over there, where he had been wounded. And in the modern version, again, he has served in Afghanistan in the 21st century conflict over there. Sherlock on the right, in the original, he's talking about something as a three-pipe problem. In the relocation, he's giving up smoking, and he actually talks about something as a three-patch problem. So this began to interest me because it's something in translation, and I'm very interested in translation and translation studies. It's something in translation you quite often do find as a strategy, relocating. Now, what are the actual boundaries of relocation? Could you relocate a map of Norwich? Well, probably at your peril, because let's imagine, you're doing this for a guidebook to be published in Germany about Norwich. Should you really talk about Alexandra Road as Alexanderstrasse, might start getting people a little bit confused. Or maybe, rather than printing a map of Norwich, why not just print a map of Berlin? And we could then save all the problem. We've got a map of Berlin, and we've relocated Norwich to Berlin. Well, again, you're going to really, really, really confuse people if you do that. But you could relocate a play by George Bernard Shaw. Now, there's George Bernard Shaw's most popular play, I think, Pygmalion. Partly because of the musical, isn't it, My Fair Lady? It's a really popular play by Shaw. And you could choose to relocate this. It's a play which has frequently been relocated. And the big question to a translator is, or a director, is what are you going to choose to maintain? Now, the interesting about relocation is it actually gets rid of the central paradox of translation. What is a central paradox of translation? Well, it's this. Here I am reading a novel by Gustave Flaubert, and I'm reading it in English. And the main character, Madame Bovary, comes into the room and starts to speak. And she begins to speak, of course, in English. But of course, there is a contradiction there because she would actually have been speaking in French at the time. And we're going to do this kind of let's pretend game that in the world of the translation, in the imagined world of the translation, Emma Bovary is speaking English. And by relocating that, so if we actually set Madame Bovary in Birmingham, for example, then we can actually get round that problem. Malcolm, why isn't this working?
Oh, should have a quick look. That is a good question.
Oh, there we go.
Just click, I suppose.
Click
on the mouse.
Yeah, on the mouse. Okay. On the left.
Yeah.
Right, here we go.
Don't edit that bit out.
Well, so if we're actually going to relocate something, I've just talked about what can be maintained. Let's actually have a look at that. Here are a couple of Pygmalions which have been done. On the left, you see one where the director hasn't relocated. There's an actor in Covent Garden of the early 20th century. On the right, it has been relocated. So you see, for example, that the actor there is sitting on the sort of crate that you'd associate with the current world. Look at the buckets, etc. Look at the way the actor is dressed, etc. Sarah Ramos Pintus has had a go at mapping the ways that you can relocate something. So let's talk about Pygmalion. What could you do? Well, let's imagine that we're translating this into Portuguese, okay? But our first possibility is we do the translation to Portuguese, but we set it in London in 1916. So we set this in London in 1916. We have kept the time, we have kept the place, but we have changed the language. What about actually still translating to Portuguese, but we actually move it to London in 2024? This time we've actually kept the place, Shaw's play is set in London, but we've actually changed the time now. And so obviously if we're moving it to 2024, we can do things with the language, which maybe we couldn't do if we were translating this to 1916. Third possibility, let's actually move it to Lisbon. We're translating to Portuguese. So let's move it to Lisbon. Let's move the whole play to Lisbon. So whereas those two actors have got St. Paul's Church, Covent Garden behind them, we would choose a place in Lisbon for them. And we'll actually keep our current year, we'll keep it to 2024. So have Lisbon in 2024. That means we can do things with the clothing, we can do things with the props, and we can do things with the language because it's now a contemporary setting in 2024. Or we could move it to Lisbon, but this time we'll go for 1916, the same year that Shaw had. So we've got Lisbon, we've got a cultural transplantation, and yet at the same time, we may have to bring in our language a little bit. The four possibilities of maintaining or changing something in time and space. I'm now going to click on the fateful mouse. It worked. Let's have a look at a textual example. Let's take a poet. Let's take one of my favorite poets. So this is Horace, who died about 65 to 68 BCE. Now, I'm going to read you this in Latin. I've got a very annoying habit when I read Latin of switching between classical and ecclesiastical pronunciation. So if you spot me doing that, please forgive me. It's to do with my background. And I apologize for that in advance. Now, with this, I've actually glossed it. Okay, so I've got the Latin and I've glossed it. Now, what is a gloss? A gloss is when you actually put a word for word translation under the foreign language in order to show people who don't have that language what is actually going on in the source. So let's have a look at the English first of all. We get this. What many graceful, you boy in roses, drenched in liquids, urges fragrant, pleasing Pyrrha under cave. To whom yellow you tie up hair, simple in elegances. I'll now read the Latin to you, and with a bit of luck, you can be able to sort of see what the Latin means by matching the Latin to the words underneath. Try and go quite slowly. Quis multa graculis te pur in rosa, perfusus liquidis urget oribus, grato Pyrrha sub antro. Qui flawem legidas comam, simplex munditiis. Now, that's not going to work as a translation, is it? You can't say, please translate this Horace poem for me. Somebody says to me, and I say, okay, here it is. Will that do? Can you publish that? They're going to say, no, of course we can't. So let's turn to a literary translator. Let's turn. Anthony Hecht is a great poet, and he wrote some really lovely translations from Horace. So let's actually look at how Anthony Hecht translated this, and let's see how close he stays to the Latin. Anthony Hecht. What well-heeled knucklehead, straight from the unisex hairstylist, and bathed in Russian leather, dallies with you these late summer days, Pyrrha, in your expensive sublet? For whom do you slip into something simple by, say, Gucci? Oh, yes, he stayed close to Horace there, hasn't he? Well, of course, if you actually, it will probably dawn on most readers that Gucci wasn't, they're not that old, are they? And, they weren't around in Horace's day. So it will dawn on most readers that, Hecht has actually done a relocation. He's brought it forward in time. We've got something like Gucci, which is a contemporary reference, or Russian leather, the perfume. But he also seems to have moved it in place as well, because Horace was a Roman poet and was writing, living in the city of Rome, patronized by the imperial family and friends. But, when you see a word like knucklehead, that's suggesting to me USA, 20th century USA, or a sublet. Again, that's not suggesting English to me. That's suggesting American English to me. So, and this, I think, dialogue quite well with some of the stuff we're doing this morning. This is kind of moving a Latin poem to the USA. And Hecht is clearly looking at the effects this is going to have on his reader. Literature is all about the effects that things have on readers. It's about the poetic effects that people have. And somebody I think who's paid great attention to this in her translation is Adriana Hunter. Now, a few years ago, this novel came out by Frédéric Beigbeder. If you've never read it, I think it's fantastic. And in French, it's called 99 francs. Except, of course, it's not called that in French at all. It's called 99 francs. Okay, and look at the way the visuals have been done with that kind of discounted sticker on the front. And that's been translated into English by Adriana Hunter. And she's translated it as £9.99. And that's a really interesting translation of 99 francs, £9.99. Now, when doing this, she kind of clashes against what Robert Adams has written about translation theory. He's written this: Paris cannot be London or New York. It must be Paris. Our hero must be Pierre, not Peter. He must drink an aperitif, not a cocktail. Smoke Gauloise, not Kent's. And walk down the Rue du Bac, not Back Street. Now, against that, Hunter says this: £9.99 is a translation from Frédéric Beigbeder's 99 francs, or 99 francs. The setting of the novel has also been transposed from Paris to London. And so the English edition varies in some respects from the original. The English edition varies in some respects from the original. And it does. You could imagine having a fairly confused conversation with a French speaker who'd read this novel, and you say, I really, really love that bit, where he's walking through Covent Garden. And they say, it never goes to Covent Garden in the book. What are you talking about? Are you talking about that bit where he's in Montmartre? I think you're getting a bit confused here. But what's the novel about? What is that novel about? Well, it's actually a satire on capitalism. It's about an advertiser living in Paris. And by transposing it to London, Hunter really manages, ironically, to keep the universality of this. Because you're not going to sit there and read it and say, this is a novel, trying to attack French capitalism. It's a novel which is trying to attack capitalism, full stop, the advertising industry, full stop. And by moving it to London, to an imagined geography, strangely enough, Hunter can actually keep what is universal by changing the local. Now, I noticed this morning in the sessions about the USA, there's a lot of talk about the local and the universal, or the local and the global. And this, in a sense, is what translation's all about. What's universal about your text, and what's local about your text? And what are you going to preserve, and what are you going to do? Let's get back to drama. Now, I've said that literature is all about effects that plays, novels, poems have on their readers. And you see this very clearly when in drama. This is the play Lysistrata by Aristophanes, which was written around 411 BCE. Now, if you don't know it, it's a play about the women of Greece, not just Athens, the whole women of Greece, who are completely fed up with the fact that the Greek city-states have been in a state of constant war over a number of years. And they decide to do something about this. And under the leadership of Lysistrata, they go on a sex strike against their husbands. You therefore get a battle between the sexes going on in the play, but the play is also making some very serious points about warfare. This play has become favourite with feminist theatre groups and with feminist directors, and is very frequently performed. For a start, it gives women actors a great opportunity because there are unusually for Greek drama, there are an awful lot of women in the cast, in the chorus, etc. And the main character, of course, is a woman. And there on the right, you see a modern production of Lysistrata, and you can see again we've got the relocation going on. Now, if you're going to put a play on, you don't want to bore your audience. You actually want to entertain them, don't you? I saw Lysistrata in Cambridge a few years ago, and it was actually in Greek. I went to see it in Greek. It had surtitles, and so they kept the original language. But what they did do, which was really interesting, was they updated a lot of the jokes, because the jokes that Aristophanes makes are just not going to be funny anymore, because you have to actually know a lot about Athenian politics of the time to actually get them. So, for example, halfway through Lysistrata, Donald Trump walked onto the stage. Well, not in person. Don't go away, think he was in person. It was an actor pretending to Donald Trump. Okay. And everyone thought this was very funny, because someone had said, we need to find a politician. Oh, it's going to have to be a really corrupt one. Who should we find? And suddenly Donald Trump walks on. Now, if they'd had the original Greek politician coming on, it would have fallen flat. And that's not what you want if you're selling tickets. So relocation is going to be a good idea for you. Strangely enough, Boris Johnson joined him a little bit later on stage, and the audience thought this was fantastic. Now, this has been translated. Lysistrata has been translated as Loose Strife by David Stuttard. And David Stuttard says this: in my own version, I have created a parallel world, the foundation of which is 5th century Athens, which is inhabited by characters with an experience of 21st century British history and mores. And I love the way, if you buy this translation, he's got these great footnotes. Whenever there's a joke, he puts a little footnote and says, please feel free to replace this with a contemporary joke. He has a scandal, he puts a scandal, he puts, please feel free to replace it with a contemporary political scandal. So this morning, for example, we have the Taylor Swift tickets, etc. That's the sort of thing you might put into this now if you were putting this on stage, because people are going to know what you're talking about. It's really contemporary. And of course, the problem about relocation is relocations can date very quickly. So they're a kind of fluid form. You don't want people to go out of date with them. Now, in the same volume, Michael Walton has kind of theorized what's going on. And he says this: if we want to find our spine, there is some balance to be reached between the sex jokes, the socio-political satire, and serious comment on war and the conduct of war. There are issues behind this play, serious issues, though located in a stage world whose conventions were established more than 2,400 years ago. And what I'm interested there is this notion of spine. We're going to relocate something, and we've seen that we can relocate with language, with time, with space. But if we're going to actually still call this a translation, we probably ought to remember that there is a spine. We've got to try and find some balance, and we've got to somehow stay loyal to this spine. Now, literary theorists tend not to talk too much about spine. They've got other words, and one word they use a lot is the master plot. Let's go back to Horace. What did Horace have to say? He said this: "Caelum non animum mutant, qui trans mare corrunt," which I've translated as, if you cross the ocean, you only change your sky, not your spirit. I think it's a lovely quote. Now, look at this. That's stills from two films. On the right, we've got the film Clueless. Now, again, I had this strange experience watching when I first saw Clueless, when it first came out. I was watching this and I thought, this is really odd. I know what's going to happen. How come? And suddenly I thought, oh, it's Emma, isn't it? It's one of my favourite novels. And of course, LDC has got a great Emma specialist who's actually done a wonderful, Barrett Tandon has done this amazing edition of Emma with everything you want to know about Emma in it. It's absolutely fantastic. It's a great work of English literature. It's problematic, but it's great. And yet it's been taken over there to Beverly Hills. So we've got still the same language, except not the same language, because the language has been changed. It's been moved to Beverly Hills. It's been moved across the ocean. But in some ways, it only changes its sky, not the spirit, because it keeps the spirit of Emma, this very spoiled, rich young woman who somehow makes moral growth through the book. And on the left, you've got a recent filming of Emma with Anya Taylor-Joy, which again keeps much closer to the book. And you can see that in the costumes. But the main point is this master plot. It's finding the master plot. And that's what's important about the imagined geographies. You can move the geography, but ultimately you want to stay loyal to the master plot. It's really interesting in translation studies. This word faithful is often used, and translation theorists tend to get quite angry when people use the word faithful. They see it's a kind of misuse of the word. It's actually using it to refer to the wrong thing. But they do tend to be okay with the word loyal. So I'm going to say this, that it's staying loyal to the master plot. It's realizing about what is universal. And all translation is about what can I maintain. I translate a lot of poetry. And one of the things I often find myself I look at a poem and think, this poem's got a very distinctive rhythm. I'm going to keep that in the English, or I'll imitate that in the English. But then I think the rhyme is going to be really difficult to keep then. Maybe I'll even get rid of the rhyme because I actually want to keep this rhythm is so distinctive. That's what I want. Or this is a lovely, lovely image in the German. It's not really going to work in English, but maybe I could bring it in there. What can I maintain? What am I not going to maintain? Simone Weil said translation is always about preservation and destruction. Preservation and destruction. And of course, that's one of the themes of her play, Venice Saved, that Venice is up for destruction, but is actually saved at the end. Not many people know that Simone Weil wrote a play, and I was listening very carefully to Malcolm this morning, so I shall say this. There's an excellent translation of Venice Saved for sale, which you can buy for Christmas presents. I translated it. So, make sure you get your copies now. So, the master plot. Do any ethical issues come up here? Well, Lawrence Venuti, the translation theorist, has identified two possible strategies in translation. He says translations can foreignize or they can domesticate. And this is our big question. Is relocation going too far in the sense of domestication? Is it actually cultural appropriation? Well, let's end where we began with Bertolt Brecht. I know that play very well. I've seen it several times. I've taught it for A-level. I've read it in English and I've read it in German. But when I saw this production where it moved to Africa, that said something that none of the other versions said to me, and I'm grateful for that. Only one more thing to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip. And the name of that book again?
Venice Saved.
Venice Saved. There we go. By Bloomsbury. Okay, in all good bookshops. Okay, so we're going to welcome our next presenter now, Iona Macduff. And Iona, I hope you may be here online. So if you would like to come on screen, if you're ready to give your presentation.
Yeah.
Oh,
can you hear me? Oh, there I am.
There you are, Iona. Hi. So I think what I might be able to do is just check you're not. So can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
And I can't hear you, unfortunately. So I'm just going to figure out what to do here.
No.
Let me have a quick think. You don't appear to be muted. So, up at the top. Up at the top. This one here? This one? There.
Yeah.
Aha.
Should be doing something. Should click on that. Oh, here it is. I don't know where that's.
So I wonder why.
Yeah.
So we want speaker, which should be working. Fine. But for some reason the sound isn't coming through.
Didn't Tom mute everybody?
It did, but I don't think Iona's muted.
No, she is. It's not muted here, is it? Unless it was. Oh no, did you just mute her?
I just muted her.
What about over here?
Hello.
Is it muted there?
Yordon's here as well.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, you can move in the end. That's really good news.
The bottom button. No, it's not muted. Try that. I think.
Okay, Iona, I think I've muted you by accident. So if you'd like to unmute yourself. I still can't hear though. Sorry, folks, we need that kind of potter's wheel. Normal service will be resumed. Yeah. Is that okay? Yes. Richard there. Has he got anything to do with this?
Participant.
So that's so she is unmuted and says if she wants to. Okay, so muted us. Oh, we'll have to ask Iona to unmute herself again. You keep muting her by.
Yeah, still can't hear.
Okay.
Should we try?
Just changed my microphone. Is this different?
Fantastic. Fantastic. This is great. Oh,
yeah, I'm here. I'm in the room. Okay. Good.
You sound great. Okay, so I think after that slightly halting beginning, don't worry, we're recording the session, but we've got a great editor, so we'll just chop on. So it'll look seamless. Okay, so Iona, are you able to share your screen with your presentation?
I actually do not have a slides, so it is me and my voice and my face, I'm afraid.
Okay. Oh,
but
that's quite fine.
It's sort of about storytelling, so maybe that's apt.
Absolutely perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm going to
Also,
turn things
yeah,
over to
also,
you.
I apologize. I've been just as this session started, I'm in Ladakh at the moment in North India, and there was just a sudden massive citywide power cut just as it started. So
Well,
I'm glad to be here because I didn't know if I was going to get back online.
Well, I shall introduce you now then, and then turn things over to you for the next 15 minutes.
Great.
So next up, folks, very excited to be joined all the way from Ladakh in northern India in this globe-trotting, globe-spanning, border-defying symposium. Iona Macduff, UEA's own Iona Macduff, talking about climate imaginaries, small stories, realities, the necessary nuance of place writing. And if you just pause for a moment, Iona, because there'll be a short burst of applause to welcome you to the floor.
Great. Funnily enough, I can't hear applause, so I don't know when it's over, but I assume it's not a long one. So I will start. Can you all hear me? Can I just check that before I start?
We can hear you loud and clear, and the applause was warm and sustained, so it's just the microphone didn't pick it up.
Yeah. It's like, okay, great. So as I say, yep, my name's Iona Macduff. I'm based in LDC. I'm part of the Critical Decade for Climate Change. So I have a project that is incorporating narrative nonfiction or creative nonfiction, but being inspired by human geography and human geography sort of approaches to research. So I'm fresh at the moment from almost 2 months of research in the Changtang region of Ladakh in northern India. And I want to talk about the process of using a small stories approach to place writing on climate and borders. A sort of slight disclaimer, because my research is so recent, these are quite nascent thoughts and reflections. I'm still in the process of processing, but I felt that it would be I knew that would be the case, and when I sent my abstract in, I thought it would be interesting to do this kind of so close to the actual practice of the research and also the writing that is emerging from it. So I wanted to start with just a quick kind of look at what place writing is or might be. I'm inspired by one of the great thinkers on space and place, Doreen Massey, and I'm sure many others in the room are too. From her writing, I really feel she understands the intimate and intertwined relationship between space, place, and story. The meanings to be found in the spatial temporal trajectories of lives lived entangled on Earth. Space, said Massey, can be seen as a simultaneity of stories so far. And so places, therefore, are collections of those stories, articulations within the wider power geometries of space. So as a place writer, I really appreciate being able to imagine place as a temporary meeting point of human and more than human trajectories, all on their own spatial and temporal terms. I find there's a sort of equality of agency inherent within that imagery, which I try to take with me into my work. Massey has also further helped me think through placeness in the context of the climate crisis. I find her term thrown togetherness very useful for that, whereby increasingly and more than ever before, components of place, be they beings, rocks, gods of the land, are being thrust into relationship with each other at increasingly faster paces in place. So telling the story of climate change is also telling the story of place, for of course climate change happens in and to places. And telling the story of place is these days, I think, also inescapably about telling its own particular experience of climate change. So just to sort of reiterate on place writing, I see that it is a type of writing that is sort of stepping out of the shadows of both travel and nature writing, laying claim to its own way of narrativizing the world. And I think its appeal is perhaps exactly in this sort of world making after Haraway, where telling and making are, as Nevis Barron says, twin projects, both wording and worlding. So of course, inherent within that is a sense of power. Who is the maker? What responsibility lies there? For as Haraway famously said, it matters what stories tell stories, it matters whose stories tell stories. So this is particularly pertinent, I think, in this critical decade of the century of destabilizing climate change, where stories of place are ways through which to understand and reckon with how we have arrived here, who we are with and responsible for, and where our trajectories, these trajectories that we're all on in place, where they could go. So I find myself interested at the moment in the actual process of place writing. Like, what is one doing in place to be able to turn place into story on the page? What are the power imbalances? How might they be attempted to be rectified? Where might we find an ethics to this process? So in an attempt to be as plural and open as possible in terms of my research methodology, I decided to take a small stories approach. I'm sure many of you in the room are very familiar with small stories, but just to give a recap for those who aren't, for those who don't know, this is after the geographer Hayden Lorimer, who studied the experiences of a student and teacher at an outdoor centre in the Cairngorm region of Scotland. As Emily Cameron has said, small stories, a small stories approach sort of focuses on stories that attend to the small, the personal, the mundane, even the local. And Georgia, try and pronounce this properly, Georgia Kopoulou takes it a stage further to say, the approach actually aims to engage the neglected stories, the stories that are potentially somewhat hidden or obscured. Though of everyday experiences, they are at risk of obfuscation by dominant narratives. So I find that this methodology could potentially help get beyond what people imagine they know about certain places, often informed by dominant narratives or their own limited personal experiences, in order to better notice, after Anna saying, the pluralism and heterogeneity inherent in stories of place, as well as potentially what one might call the spectral traces of stories that are somewhat temporally or spatially out of joint, after Till. And why would I be interested in that? Well, because I think it's important to have local perspectives at the heart of global conversations on climate change. And I do believe that small stories can be revealing of our relationships with place, and perhaps also point to ways forward that are obscured by wider narratives. In terms of place, my focus is on borders. That's a really strong part of my writing project. And that is because they are heightened theatres about which dominant narratives often abound, but and where local realities are perhaps more easily obfuscated as a result, but they're also rich with story. And as borders are places charged with meaning, as Nicholas Szymanski says, by having a focus on borders, you can open up the diverse experiences of different minority groups and constituencies, which from everything I've said so far, I imagine you realise I'm interested in doing. So just to kind of potentially problematize a little bit this idea of the small stories approach. So, Lorimer seems quite interested in looking at stories, small stories for their own sake. So looking at the particularities for their own sake, not necessarily for what they can tell us about wider narratives. And although they are in relation to wider narratives because they can trouble them, right, with their kind of different articulations, they're not necessarily throwing light on wider narratives. And so it's this idea of a turn towards thicker descriptions, understandings of the small, without that small having to say something grand about the larger picture. But I'm interested in Emily Cameron's question, who she's almost saying, are we also throwing the baby out with the bathwater to some degree with that? Does such an approach potentially abandon a necessary concern with the structural and the systemic? So I find this question interesting to at one hand be able to hold space to see the small stories for what they are in and of themselves and what they tell us about land and relating to land in a way and in a personal way with people that you meet in place, but also appreciate how they attend to or don't, or how they relate to or don't with wider power relations and wider narratives. And I like the idea of thinking about that in terms of this idea of a relational sense, instead of kind of extrapolating the small to the systemic. Okay, so this also brings me to think about the power dynamic between storyteller and writer. And I will bring the two together. But I find Mitch Rose's thinking on the inherent inequalities of non-fiction authorship useful here. So Rose puts the emphasis on power in the relationship with the other, the person, the storyteller, the person whom you are speaking with in place to understand something about place. And they say, without whom the author would have no story. So he asserts that it is not us who give the other a voice. It is they who give us ours. And I thought about that a lot while I was doing the research and found that I'm still parsing through it, but I find that this is perhaps, it doesn't quite ring fully authentically to my mind. I think in my own experience, in the meeting of writer and so-called others, there is a negotiation of voice and authorship. But I think there's an important recognition that the writer ultimately has the liberty of the final representation. So there's a weight of ethical sort of repercussion there. So in my recent work, I saw my recent work in the context of these two conversations around power dynamics, that between small stories and how they relate or don't to wider narratives, and then the negotiation of power between writer and storytellers. And the combination of both, I think, will determine how I write about place. So to kind of actually talk about how some reflections on how to do it, or how I did do it. Just quickly say that I chose the Changtung area. I'm going to multiple places, but the Changtung area of Ladakh is the borderlands with China, or Tibet, but occupied Tibet of China. And it is a high altitude plateau. It is a many bordered place. Ladakh is a many bordered place, but the Changtung itself is kind of a distinct area. And it has historically and traditionally, the people there have practiced pastoralism, whether semi-nomadic or nomadic pastoralism, which is something that is so very prevalent there. And I had the sort of, I don't know, the aim to combine small local storytelling with a style of place writing that cannot know in advance where stories will lead. And I think that's a quote, but I felt it important to not plan too much, to not try and orchestrate too much encounters, to not try and control a narrative. And so as a result, I chose the methodology of narrative inquiry as well, where one holds space for the speaker to articulate what they feel is important or wish to say. So of course, for a writer, it's quite an unnerving experience, because you have not so much control as to the content, but it's also exciting and fascinating. And the idea, according again to Cameron, is that an open ethnographic approach where space for agency is held would allow potentially political transformation to become possible, because what is visible is political. And so just to reflect partly on the process, this recent experience I've had, I think these things are potentially quite obvious, but it felt that in terms of process, when speaking with storytellers, the time and rapport and openness would lead to trust. So these were all important aspects to this time spent in place. It was never just a relationship between me and the storyteller. There were always other people present, and they all had an impact on those things, those trust, the openness, the rapport. A translator, other people around, the driver who got very interested in the research and kind of came and contributed and was actually from the region. So all of these things add to the story, the way it is told, the way it is understood and received, and also potentially the way to write about it, I think. So I like to think of these as like storied encounters, leaving much to chance. Thinking briefly about what the dominant narratives of this place would be. Well, it's a border area. There's a huge Indian military presence. There's a lot of messaging. I was there on Indian National Day, where there were kind of big celebrations about India and about the Indian army and this defense against China that is being, kind of played out on that border, in that borderland. There's also a sort of discourse in India in general about this land being very sparsely populated, very underdeveloped, almost like an empty land idea. And it's also the heartland of the Pashmina trade. So most cashmere that is produced in the world is produced on this, this kind of fairly small area. So these are these kind of wider narratives. But speaking with people, there are so many other stories, of course, that come out. There's a real sense of there being lots of grazing lands to China that is not part of the national military narrative, but the nomads have anecdotal and, you know, real life experiences of no longer being able to access grazing lands in certain valleys. The grasses are losing their nutrients, so this makes the nomads have to move around more. This is a spiritual land with many. The land itself is given spiritual meaning by the people who live there, in the form of the Yula, the gods of the land, who many believe are angered about the imbalance that is currently there. There are anecdotal stories of different populations of grazing animals increasing or decreasing related to climate as well. I think what was interesting to me is many people, when I eventually did kind of gather stories from people, often the stories were of the origins of place, about the spirits of place. And I wondered whether understanding about the way the place was created might also say something about the way forward. I think coming back to this idea of this is just my last small anecdote, which is about this idea of like the negotiation of power between the storyteller and the writer. I think I met a man called Pavlodar, and we had a kind of interesting sort of arc between us, because at first he was quite reticent about speaking and said he didn't have any stories. And then he talked to me a lot about other things. He asked me a lot of questions. He asked me my opinions about nomadic resettlement in Tibet, which is actually something I happen to know quite a bit about. He asked me how the UK treats refugees. We had a long, long conversation, many, many hours of talking. He said to me, "Okay, now you get some stories." And he told me stories of how the landscape around us was created. And then after he told his stories, he then asked me for stories of Scotland. He wanted to hear stories of the land in Scotland. So I told him about Kelpies and Selkies. And it felt to me that there was a real sort of a relationship building, but also negotiation of sharing of stories. And I suppose, just to sort of sum up my presentation, I think my question now too is that though the research method held space for agency, I'm thinking now, how also can I take what I write, how can what I write also hold this too, such that political transformation becomes possible if such a lofty goal could be achieved by a humble piece of writing. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I don't know if you heard that round of applause, Iona?
No.
Oh, but it was very heartfelt and filled the room.
No.
Yeah. Well, we have a bit of an adjustment to the running order. So how about a round of applause for Jeremy, who's just going to shuffle into the panel that follows that, back where he came from originally. But thank you very much for being such a good sport. So sorry for messing you around a little. What this is being occasioned by the arrival of Yordon from Bulgaria, the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. And I'm wondering, Rebecca, should we go to Yordon and then finish with you? Okay, excellent. So Yordon, I can see you on screen there. Are you ready to go?
Yes, I am.
And we can hear you beautifully well. Yordon, you're going to speak on the subject of a Black Sea coastscape in 3 languages. So if you could enjoy the next, we'll enjoy the next 15 minutes of your presentation. Very much looking forward to that. And as is customary, if we could just, I'll just ask you to pause for a moment for the welcome round of applause. I'm not sure you can hear that, but did you hear
I
it?
didn't.
Oh, there you go.
It doesn't matter.
It was very warm and welcoming. So anyway, I shall turn things over to you for the next 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you too. Am I supposed to play the slides by myself?
If you're able to share your screen, they should appear. And hopefully we'll fill the screen.
Just a moment.
I also have, if you'd rather, what I could do is I could put them on the screen here and you could just tell me when to click through if you'd rather.
Okay, I would prefer this option.
Let's
I
do
have
that.
my minor additions, but it doesn't matter. I would prefer that you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Okay, so you're up and away.
Please, slide number 2. Slide number 2. So, spiritual landscape is a spiritual reality reflected and constructed both mimetically and non-mimetically. It is not a material landscape invested with spiritual meaning. It can be prior to material landscapes, shaping human perceptions of one or another of them so that they could host or embody a spiritual one. The concept of spiritual landscape, thus understood, recalls the divide between spiritual and material realities and leaves on the hind the one between constructed and pre-given reality. Let us assume that the landscape is a perceivable or imaginable spatial structure larger in scale than man, hence not a signified of a portrait, and smaller than God, hence not a signified of cosmography. A geography would be larger than landscape and smaller than cosmography. A seascape and a coastscape are conceptualized by analogy. Please, slide number 3. In what follows, I explored 2 literatures which are geographic neighbors but poorly know each other in one of their intertextual meetings. I would analyze the translatability of a Georgian coastscape imbued with cultural memory into Bulgarian. The proposed Georgian-Bulgarian comparison will systematically keep the door open for tripartite reconstruction that would detect the role of influential metropolitan translation. Metropolitan translation is assumed to be one of the intermediaries between colonial or like peripheries. This triple setting is an initial attempt to add macro-historical perspective to the case. I explored the potential of an under-translated coastscape to support a cross or trans-Pontic, trans-Black Sea comparative literature. Such a comparative literature would first try to detect tonalities and contrasts between pairs of Pontic literatures, implying their shared belonging to a muted or simply frozen interliterary community, rather than to a casual multitude created ad hoc by scholarly speculation. In the present case, Russian literature is approached as the potential factor stimulating muteness or freezing. I address now one of several possible approaches to a coastscape, a poem-wide modeling of how a human confronts sea. It is the poem Pont Yuxain by Tizian Tabidze in the original and in two translations, mainly a Bulgarian one. Please slide number 4. Nikolai Kanchev is one of the 9 important poets in the alternative canon of the communist era Bulgarian poetry. In 1985, a Bulgarian anthology of Georgian poetry, selected and translated from the Russian by Kanchev, appeared, titled A Breath of Being. By then, Kanchev had been already at home within both the official and non-official currents of Georgian literary life. In his book of poems, Presences, published in 1965, he had included a chapter titled Georgia 1964. 10 poems out of 35 in all. Sixth in the cycle was a poem titled Tizian Tabidze, semicolon, 1937. Tizian, who had perished in 1937, was the sole Georgian poet featured in a poem's title within the book. In the same year, 1964, a selection of 41 poems by Georgi Leonidze in book form was published, in translation from Russian by Kanchev. Leonidze was initially a symbolist poet who enjoyed long life and was the director of the Academic Institute of Georgian Literature in Tbilisi in 1957-66. By 1983, the Georgian side had succeeded in mirroring the gesture of friendship with returns. The short preface to Kanchev's second book of poems in Georgian stated he had been twice on long creative vacations in Georgia. Please, slide number 5. To return to breadth of being, Tizian Tabidze occupies a prominent place in it, with 10 poems. Kanchev completes his introduction to the anthology with the following footnote, quotation, "The poems in the book are translated after literal translations from Georgian to Russia, availed to me by the Union of Georgian Writers in Tbilisi." End of quotation. In what follows, I will be following the original, verse by verse, or stanza by stanza, adding my literal translation. I will be adding, then, my literal translations of the Bulgarian translation by Kanchev and the literal translation of one of the published Russian translations by Lev Ozerov. Please, slide 6. Note on translations. As a translator, I subscribe to the principles of translating the poetics of a work, as demonstrated in Henri Mechonic's Poetics of Translating. This translatological perspective, alongside the post-colonial view on Russian-Georgian intercultural imagination, pioneered by Susan Leighton, informs my critical stance on the published translations cited below. In comparing verbatim English translations, I'm indebted to the method called by Hatuna Beridze inter-reflexive translation studies and practiced by this Georgian scholar in several of her works. Let me proceed now to Evskinis Ponti, as it sounds in Georgian. To spare time, I will be showing the texts slide by slide and will be reading only my comments. Please, slide number 7. First stanza and first line. Here Conchev makes a shift from praising the sea to praising its name. The Russian translation is open to the mentioned shift because the signifiant of the Russian sentence is ambiguous. It can be both the sea and its name. And it, like the Bulgarian one, transforms a statement into an exclamation. These are two indirect indications that Bulgarian translator had not used an interlinear from Georgian. In the second verse, Conchev remarkably shifts from C's voice to the voice of the lyrical I, from interrogation to exclamation, from portraying the sea to self-gratulation, from assessment of value to assessment of appearance. Unlike Ozerov, Conchev preserves the idea of a poetry or of non-instrumental music, having kept the word voice. Ozerov eliminates the semantic ambivalence of the verb, but Conchev eliminates the verb itself. Ozerov is overall quite closer to the original. Please, slide number 8. Verse number 3. Here, agency is removed by Conchev from the sea and is ascribed to the human lyrical I. Second, the object of remembrance or revealing is given here in an abstract form, legends instead of media. Concretization will follow in the next line. Ozerov's modest changes in the actant structure deprive the sea from agency. From agent of storytelling, it has become an instrument or a piece of such. Conchev has gone further by shifting the attention to the perceiver of the storytelling and completely obscuring the actant situation. And the fourth line. Here, due to the semantics of the word that plays the role of grammatical subject, Shiva, the Georgian text is ambiguous or ambivalent. It implies a shiver from either cold or heat. Bulgarian translator has chosen the first option and the Russian the second one. It seems to me that the quasi-oxymoron hints at the possibility that the lyrical I has been in the condition of emotional or spiritual death. Conchev's greater and apparent inaccuracy is path-dependent. He had not mentioned media in the previous line. Both translations go further. The Georgian poet could have said Damitsha, burnt me, or burnt my, but he did not. He refrains from singling out the percipient. His heart is one among a principally infinite series of hearts burnt. He refrains from explicitly identifying the perceiver with the lyrical I. Lastly, he refrains from explicating the source of the psychosomatic condition indicated in the line, hence leaves some room for receiving that condition as a kind of an agent per se, translators do not show analogical restraint. Please slide number 9, the second stanza. First line. First, original description is replaced in the translation by a narration about a movement towards the depicted object. Hence, again, the human observer foregrounds the sight. Second, the indirect, through the device of comparison, identification of golden fleece with perceptible effects of lime burning is diluted but retained. The less pronounced identification of maritime cohis with the lime pit and of the hinterland supporting the existence of fleece-owning cohis with a dragon is almost annihilated. Having read the second stanza, the reader can return to the first one and realize that the ambivalent condition of the heart of the lyrical eye, shivering either from cold or from heat, was probably rooted in a human condition within a metaphysical lime pit, and therefore invest more significance in the implicit twin image of pit for hydrating lime. In rendering these two lines of the stanza, Russian translator Ozerov is maximally close to the original. We can see now that what I would call an accurate translation was not an intention of the Bulgarian translator. Slide number 10. Kunchev transforms the condition of a follower who died before the cause for condition. In the original, by you or thee is meant the sea, while the translation has added the secondary option of identifying you with media. Here, once again, Russian translation is closer to the original, and once again, it seems that Bulgarian translator has utilized neither an interlinear from the original nor the cited Russian translation. None of the translators retains the stanza's last word, autskavi, unwatered, unhydrated, which subsists the symbolism of lime pit as purgatory and as a site that burns and hydrates. Please slide 11. Third stanza. The uses of the word metzkeri, landslide, across the poetry of Titian suggest that he conceives the tissue of the sea, of land, and of, so to say, the river of life as one and the same, as an eroding, impending, and misleading element. Here, he does not speak of Argo, but of Argos, the constructor of Argo and one of the Argonauts. A new Argo would be a product of Orpheus, the poet. It would be a poetic, material-spiritual ship. At this point, Orpheus is compared not to the egoistic hero Jason, but to Argos, the ship builder. While Bulgarian translation manipulates the stanza, please let us go to the next 12th. Yes, slide 12. While the Bulgarian translation manipulates the stanza, Russian one only simplifies it. The comparison between the three texts confirms the Bulgarian auto-stereotype of Bulgarian insensitivity to sea. Slide 13, please. The fourth stanza. Bulgarian lines of this stanza by Kunchev hardly resemble the original. The first line annihilates the only reference to medieval and any Georgian history in the poem. Thus, Georgian, or of the lyrical I, temporal identity, is reduced to the duality of personal actuality and prehistorical myth, that is, to the temporality of myth. Georgians are made an unhistorical nation. Ozerov is more or less accurate. Please, the next slide, in order to see the ending of the stanza.
Okay. Oh, Yordon, just to say, I'm enjoying this, but I think just in order that the
Yes,
next...
I think
Super.
that I should skip all this and just go to my summary and conclusion. Am I right?
Okay, if that's okay. Here we are at the summary.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Just a moment. So the translations, especially the Bulgarian one, are recurrently stricken by non-sensitivity to and even erasure of sea. Sea beyond abstraction and beyond visuality. Sea that holds a complex perceptibility. And by low sensitivity to cosmography or non-scientific picture of the world. They either dilute or remove the symbol of lime pit that illuminates about 3 of the original stanzas. The multi-layered image of a lime pit associable with purgatory, dragon's jaws, human gullet, and coastal town likened to a flying up white pigeon constitute the coastscape that keeps the parts of this poem together. Kunchev is able to shape an alternative coastscape, one based on the perceived vocal harmony between the lyrical I, the sea, and the Argonauts, and on the parallel inability of the lyrical I to see or touch the sea and to from one's heart. A coastscape reworking a Christian topos and reflecting a quest for salvation is transformed into a coastscape reworking a romanticist topos and reflecting a quest for self-expression. Kunchev de-exoticizes the Georgian realm without making it more complex. His translations de-Georgianizes the chronotope by reducing it to personal and topographical actualities and prehistorical archetypes. Allusion to Christian, maybe Dantesque cosmography and human condition can be rearticulated in fate in insensitive terms, or reduced to its de-Christianized facet. Thus, one feels in Tizian's poem a masochistic drive towards enthusiastic suffering in the hands of an element for one's inevitable guilt, which certainly is a presentiment of the psychic epidemic of fear and enthusiasm during the great purges of the 1930s. However, the delicate presence of Christian symbolism compels us to consider the drive as an intention for martyrdom. As for the translations, they tend to reduce the drive to a craving for media, but do not succeed even in this. And my conclusion please. Last slide. The comparison between a Georgian original of a Black Sea Coastscape poem and two of its translation, a Bulgarian and a Russian one, confirms the expectation that a poet with less symbolical capital as a poet would produce a more punctual translation. It seemingly confirms another common sense expectation, namely that an indirect translation would be less accurate than a direct one. However, it turned out that our case cannot be considered fully relevant to the distinction. For the Bulgarian translator who used an intermediary language, Russian, claimed that he has used a literal translation into that language. The literal translation produced by me indirectly shows a lack of intention for accurate translation on behalf of Kunchev. Beyond any hypothetic intention of the translator, his work supports the auto-stereotype of Bulgarian insensitivity to sea and contributes to a Russian-Soviet agenda for cultural colonization in the region. Thank you very much for your patience.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And again, I'm afraid you can't hear the very fulsome applause that has resounded around the room, but thank you very much for that indeed. And next up is, if we could welcome to the stage, I shall get out your way. Oh, I should get your PowerPoint. Yeah, it's your PowerPoint. Oh, I was going to do, I thought I was going to get away with doing that smoothly, but it's actually, it's smooth enough. Yeah. Okay, all right. All right. We should welcome to the stage Rebecca Pinnock. Lessons, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'm sort of still the papers that I've just listened to and enjoyed are still kind of resonating, and my temptation is to start making connections, but that's not for me to do. So let me just sort of say what I'm going to say, and then hopefully there'll be time, even if it's time over tea and coffee, to make those connections. I'm going to talk to you today about a very small geographical example. I want to talk to you today about East Anglia. And I also want to talk to you specifically about medieval East Anglia. As some of you know, that's my specialism. I'm a scholar of the Middle Ages. I'm based here at UEA in the School of Literature, Drama and Creative Writing, very much in the literature bit. And I've also taught in the history department as well. So as a medievalist, I'm very much committed to interdisciplinary ways of working. So I want to take you back in time, and I also want to transport you from where we've just been on the Black Sea coast, much closer to where we are here in Norwich. And I want to start by just suggesting, I hope this doesn't sound defensive, but suggesting how I think what I'm going to say is sort of relevant to the topic of this wonderful conference. And I want to do that by actually addressing the image that I've used on my title slides. This is a detail of a 14th century medieval map. If we had more time, I'd be really cruel and get you to try to guess where it is. But given the title of my talk, you might have guessed anyway that this is in fact East Anglia. But in accordance with the conventions of medieval map making, East is at the top. Now, if I show you this version of it, that detail is on the left of the slide. That might start, for those of you familiar with the outline of East Anglia, to look a little bit more like the region. And then in context, where I've circled on the larger map, the area that I've extracted as a detail, again, it might not be that easy to make out, but this is a plausible stab at a map of the British Isles. Things go very wrong when we get north of the border into Scotland, where the map maker just sort of gives up and has a bit of a go. But in general, I think this is a sort of a reasonable outline. But that is not in itself, fascinating though this is, why I wanted to show you this and why I wanted to start with this. It is the shift of perspective that I really want to focus on. As I've shown you already, to orientate ourselves to something that's familiar, in this case, we need to turn that map sideways. We need to reorientate our perspective. And for me, one of the things that the past offers, and one of the ways in which the past speaks to the present, is through that act of estranging and of defamiliarizing places which might be very familiar to us. It invites us and it requires us, I think, to look at them afresh. And this is really what I'm attempting to do in my current research. And what I'm speaking about today is a small aspect of that. My bigger current project is interested in the perception and depiction of landscapes in the Middle Ages, particularly East Anglia. So the area I'm studying in geographical terms is very small and focusing on one region. But for me, this methodology affords depth. It enables me to go into detail with a relatively restricted number of sources, but it also enables me to take a longer chronological view. So I'm working with sources from the 7th centuries to the 16th centuries CE, and you'll be very relieved to know, I suspect, that I'm only talking to you today about one of those. So this necessitates an interdisciplinary approach. How do I contextualize those sources? It's not just sufficient to contextualize them in relation to each other as written sources. I feel that I need to contextualize them in relation to, say, archaeological evidence, art historical evidence, and that's what I'm doing in my bigger project. So I'm focusing on East Anglia, how people in the past perceived and depicted the natural world around them, in a sense, how they engaged imaginatively with their own geography. Because as well as looking at depictions of East Anglia, I'm looking at sources created within that region. So people writing about their own place. And for any of you who know East Anglia, given the nature of the landscape, which one medieval author memorably described as washed by waters on almost every side. Indeed, if you've tried to drive through parts of it, perhaps to travel here today, you might have experienced that yourselves. The water often overflows. Given the nature of the landscape, I'm focusing on watery landscapes, waterscapes, in my bigger projects, including the coastal, the riverine, the fenland, and so on. And it's the fens that I want to talk about today. So for those of us who aren't familiar, what are the fens? The fens refers to both a type of landscape and is used as a geographical referent as well. It's quite hard to define precisely in terms of its precise borders in landscape terms, but I've circled the rough area here. And it's an area of low-lying marshlands, approximately 1,500 square miles in size, located in the east of England, southeast of Lincolnshire, Cambridgeshire, westernmost parts of Norfolk and into Suffolk as well. And most of the fens lie within a few metres of sea level. And as with similar landscapes in the Netherlands, for example, much of the Fenland originally consisted of fresh or saltwater wetlands, but most of this has now been drained for agricultural use. In fact, if I show you the next image, the next slide, this image on the left, so it shows a typical kind of post-drainage Fenland landscape, lots of straight lines, drainage ditches, very rich agricultural land. And we know we're increasingly coming to realise that the East Anglian fens have been intensively managed for millennia. But wholesale drainage took place in the 17th and 18th centuries CE. So our first imaginative act for today is to transport ourselves to pre-drainage East Anglia. We're going back to the medieval Fenland, an extensive, productive landscape where the boundaries between land and water are often indistinct. And this quotation from a wonderful book, Imperial Mud, by James Boyce, I think sums this up very well. He says that until a few hundred years ago, the rivers that flowed from central England to the North Sea metamorphosed into a wetland wilderness as they approached the Wash. Encouraged by low gradient and high sediment, they broke their banks to meander into countless and ever-changing channels, forming vast reed-covered fens, shallow bird-friendly lakes, and nutrient-rich summer meadows, more akin to the Amazonian delta than the ordered agricultural landscape that the fens have now become, something perhaps more akin to that image on the right. So, my questions for today then are, how were the fens imagined in the Middle Ages? And how do these depictions, these medieval depictions of the Fenland, engage with the notion of imagined geographies? Because after all, the fens are an entirely real landscape. They've transformed over time, but they have a physical present reality. It's my contention, though, that the medieval Fenland is, in fact, one of the most imaginatively overdetermined landscapes in medieval England. It's been written about and mythologized about more than most other landscapes or waterscapes. And crucially, I think we're still living with the legacy of that imaginative landscape construction today. And to put it very bluntly, the fens, even today, still have a very bad reputation. They're regarded as flat, desolate, bleak, sometimes dangerous. As the author Jeremy Page memorably put it, in many ways, the fens are an anti-landscape. I love that term. It's an absence where, without gradient and other usual definable features, it can feel as though the true landscape has been scraped away. End quotation. And it's this metaphorical blank canvas onto which many writers over many centuries have imposed their own idea of the fens, their own imagined geography, to suit their particular whims and motivations. And this started, in terms of the written record, in the Middle Ages. So today I want to take you back to where it all started. This started, as far as I can tell, I would be thrilled, more thrilled than I can imagine, you can imagine, if you know of an earlier source. But as far as I can find, the very earliest detailed description of the fens was written in the mid sort of 730s, 740s CE. And this is The Life of St. Guthlac by Felix. Apart from his name, we know virtually nothing about the author, but it's likely that he was a monk at a Fenland monastery at Crowland. And that's likely for a number of reasons, but not least because it is the protagonist of his story was the founder of that monastery. St. Guthlac was a hermit at Crowland, and this monastic community grew up there after his death. Although we know very little about Felix, he does tell us a lot about St. Guthlac, and it's rich in detail, this text, really rich in really compelling detail. We learn, for example, that Guthlac was born in the 670s CE in the English Midlands, in what was then known as the Kingdom of Mercia. So for those of you that can see, there's Little East Anglia over there on the right in yellow, and the huge Kingdom of Mercia, which was geographically but also politically and militarily very dominant in this earlier medieval period. Felix tells us that Guthlac was a prince. He was born into the royal family of Mercia, and for his early life engaged in what at the time were typical princely activities: hunting, raiding, fighting, being a soldier. But Guthlac turns his back on this to become a monk and devote himself to God. This is actually quite a standard story in medieval saints' legends. It's almost this sort of conversion narrative that Guthlac experiences. But what is unusual and what really interests me is the role that the landscape plays in this narrative. Now, I am not, and I've never intended to read this entire passage to you. What I have done, though, is highlight a few key words. I hope those are visible. So I'm going to kind of gloss this passage and speak around it for a few minutes. Our author, Felix, tells us that Guthlac was initially happy with his life as a monk. He was a monk in Mercia, in his home kingdom, but over time, this just wasn't enough. And Guthlac wanted an even more extreme and even more ascetic way of life. And he yearned to live the solitary life as a hermit. And I don't know, maybe some of us have all had that feeling from time to time. But Guthlac really took this to extremes. He left his comfortable Midlands monastery in his home kingdom of Mercia and set out to find the most remote, most uninhabited, most inhospitable place he possibly could. And this, as you probably guessed, turned out to be the Fens. Sounds like I'm being very down on the Fens. I'm really not. I'm not seeking to offend anyone from there. Guthlac is absolutely thrilled when he hears that there is such a desolate place where he can set up and live his new life as a hermit. It's referred to as a vast desert, which is curious because, of course, the Fens is anything but dry. It's a very soggy place. But this idea of a desert comes from very early church writings. The desert fathers, so-called the hermits, who sought out a life of solitude in the deserts of the Holy Land. It's deliberately evoking that sort of imagery. So Guthlac's thrilled when he learns of this vast desert, a dismal fen of immense size, marshes, bogs, black waters overhung by fog, sometimes studded with wooded islands, traversed by the windings of tortuous streams, and supposedly also the haunt of demons. I mean, this is really quite the guidebook, isn't it? But this is exactly what Guthlac wants. He wants to test himself, to test his faith. So he travels into this landscape. And it's this aspect of what happens to Guthlac when he's settled in the Fens that has occupied scholars mostly to date. And to be fair, it is a compelling story. St. Guthlac makes his home in a previously robbed out burial mound. He drinks the fen water. Yeah, he drinks the water from the Fens, and I'll leave you to make your own conclusions about what happens next. He's beset by demons, which is what's illustrated in this fabulous later medieval illustration here. But it's actually Guthlac's journey to the Fens that really interests me, and I want to spend a couple of minutes talking to you about now. Because I think this is key to how we should understand the imaginative geography of the Fens in this text, but also the later legacy of that imagining. So, when Guthlac arrives in the Fens, he is filled with purpose. He is seeking out this desolate desert place. And his desire to seek this landscape, to seek the desert, is repeated 3 times within just a few lines of the text in the Latin original. And it's replete with language of accomplishment, completion. And although Felix, our author, has spent the previous 20-odd chapters stressing how holy and peaceable Guthlac is, he's become a monk after all, it's almost as though at this point Guthlac reverts to his sort of previous ways, because his settlement in the Fens, his journey to the Fens, is absolutely filled in the Latin with the language of conquest, military language of being a soldier, even though he is ostensibly going in peace and solitude. Guthlac reaches the uninhabited island, which the Latin makes clear is a burial mound, and decides to dwell there alone, despite the demons that are rumoured to haunt this landscape. And to me, this really reads more like a military campaign, a military conquest than a spiritual journey. I'm sparing you the Latin today. I do not have Philip's skill with Latin, so we'll stick with the English, but I hope you'll take my word for it, that the language here is really at odds with what the story is attempting to convey. It seems almost as though that this burial mound in which Guthlac settles is presented to him, and it's also as though he's possessed of a kind of manifest destiny to settle and civilize this place, previously occupied solely by fiends. And this colonial impulse, evident in Felix's Life of Guthlac, has previously been acknowledged. But for me, I think one of the most suggestive details occurs in relation to one of the many assaults by demons which Guthlac experiences. Because our author, Felix, intriguingly conflates these demons who, in this image, are hybrids, bestial, anything but human. They are other. Our author, Felix, conflates the demons with Britons. And Briton is a term used in this period in the early Middle Ages to refer to essentially what we might now think of as the indigenous people of this region. Before the Germanic settlers arrived from continental Europe, in the west of the British Isles, these people would usually be referred to as Celts. These are problematic terms, but what is key here is that we have Guthlac, who is a descendant of these settlers from continental Europe, arriving in this area. And to attempt to terrify him even more, these demons imitate the speech of Britons. So there's definitely a colonial impulse present in this text, without any doubt at all, I think. Now, we might very well question whether the author Felix actually thought that the fens were full of demons, but that's a question for another day. What I want to sort of just almost conclude with now is why this originates in this period. What is actually going on in this text? The fens today, I think, are usually depicted as marginal, on the edge, both geographically, sometimes culturally. Think of Graham Swift's 1983 novel Waterland, for instance, where communities are isolated, cunning women dispense medical care, and the past kind of bleeds into the present. Now, that's a novel written and set primarily in the 19th and 20th centuries. But this very much resonates with what we see in our medieval texts. The idea of the fens is this kind of other place, this imagined land somewhere on the edge. This is, remember, where Guthlac travels to, away from his home. But the political reality was actually very different. If I put this map up here again, what we can see, of course, is that where Guthlac settled, I've marked Crowland, which is where Guthlac settled. It is on the edge, but it's on the edge of two kingdoms. It's on the edge of East Anglia, the edge of Mercia. And by virtue of being on two edges, we could almost say that it's central. It's in the middle. This is a border territory. At the time that Guthlac settled there, this colonial impulse, he is almost taking with him into these borderlands, this sort of manifest destiny of his princely heritage from Mercia. He is deliberately, I think, settling in this contested area, in this contested zone. Even more intriguingly, it is a member of the East Anglian royal family, so this rival dynasty, who commissions Felix to write the text. So we can see our saint Guthlac almost kind of being fought over by these royal families after his death, after he's been revered as a saint. And it's in this context, I think, that we need to understand the depiction of the geography, the depiction of the Fenlands. It serves the purposes of both the author and the family commissioning the text, and also to an extent the rival faction as well, for this to be an empty landscape filled only with demons, because whoever manages to get territorial control over this area via this story, via this holy figure, he can be appropriated. He is the one, Guthlac, who civilizes this landscape, who inhabits it, who drives out the demons. This is depicted as a land that is up for grabs, empty, ripe for colonization. In reality, we know that that was far from the case. The fens today are not an empty landscape. At the period that our text was written and the period it was set, this was not an empty landscape either. I'd be very happy to talk more about some of the recent archaeological work that has been done, which demonstrates this, but I hope, for the benefit of time, you might take my word for it, that there has been some groundbreaking, pun intended, work recently that has actually demonstrated that the fens were populated, but on a seasonal basis throughout the Middle Ages, pre-drainage. This was an incredibly rich, incredibly diverse, occupied land, to say nothing of the wildlife as well. Now, where does that leave us? How do we bring this up to date? And this really is my last point. We still live to some extent with this legacy of the Fens as an edge place, an empty place, a marginal place. And again, as James Boyce says, the dominant narrative remains that of sort of progress, this teleological progress from malaria-ridden swampland filled with devils and demons through to productive, ordered agricultural lands. That legacy, that idea starts in the Middle Ages, and it is born out of this territorial conflict, this political conflict, this land grab, essentially. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that we experience that legacy through to the present day. And for one, I'm delighted to say that there are rewilding projects happening in the Fens. The Fens are being re-fenned in places. Now, there is, of course, a much more complex story to fill in the gaps between then and now, but I hope, if you'll forgive the plug, that you might all want to come to a conference that my colleague James Wood and I will be organising next year on literary depictions of the Fens. So I hope this has been of interest in and of itself, but it was also a shameless plug for something to come. So thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. I've run a couple of minutes over time.
Well, that's been quite a dizzying scurry around the world. We've been to India, we've been to Bulgaria, we've been back to ancient Rome and medieval East Anglia as well. This country's never been the same since the Mercian conquest of East Anglia. I think it's all been downhill since then. So I'm sure everyone is raring to go for a refreshment, cup of tea. I think we have 10 minutes till the next panel. I wonder if Philip and Rebecca, if you'd be available for conversations, questions, and follow-ups at the break, if that would be okay. So should we dissolve gradually towards the coffee and tea, and our speakers are kindly available to the buttonhole. Thank you very much. Thank you.